Queen's Gambit is one of the most famous openings in the entire chess history. It's partially due to the series Queen's Gambit, but not only that, people have played this opening for like 500 years, as long as people are playing chess in general. That is an incredibly solid opening, and it's always a surprise for me how with so many hundreds of years and now engines just dominating chess, showing us how stupid we humans are, these openings like Queen's Gambit, they are still completely playable, they are still rock solid, and if you really master the ideas in the Queen's Gambit, they could serve you throughout your entire chess career. So today I want to give you an ultimate guide into the Queen's Gambit declines here, which starts with the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, and what happened afterwards. We are gonna take a look today. That's the only video you need to know to understand deeply what type of ideas you get both as white and black in the Queen's Gambit declined. What's up, chess player, and welcome to the Journey to Grandmaster, the place where you can improve every single aspect of your chess game. And today's video is all about the opening theory. We are looking at the Queen's Gambit, but I'm not the type of guy who is just gonna bore you with 40 moves long theoretical variations. I rather want to explain you the ideas so you don't really care that much about what concrete moves and variations your opponent plays. You still understand the ideas behind that, and of course how you need to react, how you need to deal with those challenges, and so on. Well, there are different ways for white to go. There is typically two main moves here, knight to c3 and knight to f3. I'm gonna start with knight c3 because that is a very logical move. You just played c4, and even though this opening is called the Queen's Gambit, you are pretty much never afraid of losing this pawn because you're gonna pick it up very fast. It's called the Queen's Gambit accepted. That is not the topic of today's video. If you want to take a look at that, please let me know in the comments if you want me to create a specifically dedicated video to that. Now we are looking at all of the other opportunities black has not to take that pawn and just continue normally their development. Now, once again, there are a few options that white has here. There is bishop to g5, just immediately pinning that knight, and that limits black's potential a little bit. Or there is a move knight to f3, and of course the normal c takes d, and normally white combines that move c takes d with playing bishop to g5. I can explain you the idea behind that, because, for example, I played knight f3 so often, and then you give so many different opportunities for black. Let's count it together. Black can take immediately here on c4. Black can play the move c6. Black can play the move c5. Black can play the move bishop to b4. Black can play the move knight b to d7. Black can play the move bishop e7, and black can play the move a6. All of those are completely reasonable moves. Probably I have forgot something. For example, Nihal Sarin, Super Grandmaster, played knight to e4 against me in the World Team Chess Championship, and I was just shocked. It's like move number 4, and I have never seen that move before. But, well, fortunately for me, that game turned to be good for me. I managed to make a draw from a position of strength. But that's a completely different story, by the way. Somewhere here you can see the video or in the description if you want to take a look at that after we are done with this guide into the Queen's Gambit. Anyway, there are so many moves, but we are talking about Queen's Gambit. In the Queen's Gambit, they play bishop e7, just one wants to finish the development as fast as possible. All of those moves I have indicated. Once again, let me know in the comments if you want to take a deeper look at one of them, because pretty much all of those moves is a different opening. If you're wondering, bishop b4 here is my favorite. That is the Rogozin defense. Very dynamic opening for black. Just, yeah, sincerely recommend. Anyway, bishop e7, rock solid here. It's not like you are preparing as black to crush your opponent immediately. No, you want to get a very solid position and then go from there. Well, white once again has a choice. There are two main moves here, bishop f4 and bishop g5. Well, historically, bishop g5 is the main line, even though nowadays on the top level, bishop f4 is rather the top choice. Today, we are going to take a look at both of those lines because they are both very important in terms of understanding the ideas behind the Queen's Gambit. So let's start with the move bishop g5. This move is, well, maybe a little bit more simpler to understand. I was also growing as a kid playing this type of position or this exact position in at least every second of my games. So Well, black has a lot of alternatives here. Castles is, once again, historically what I would say the main move, even though I see that in the master database, h6 is even a little bit more popular. But I'm going to explain you the difference behind that in a moment, because there is a very important idea that you have here, and that depends on whether you play the move h6 or not. So this small detail can actually play a huge role. Now, white plays e3, just normally continues the development. I want to point out, it doesn't matter which opening you play in chess, you always must watch out for the key opening principles. What are those key opening principles? Well, to cut a long story short, they are always focus on the development, one piece, one move, always focus on the center. Center is the most important part of the board. Try to make sure that your king is safe before you do anything else, before you go all in with your attack. Then try to develop every single one of your pieces. Once again, coming back to the topic of the development, not just a handful of them, not just knights and bishops, but literally every single one of them before you start just going on with all of your pieces into the attack. So if we are talking about some concrete openings, some concrete variations, those key general principles, they still are there as a foundation for all of our ideas. It's very important to keep that in mind. With that said, white plays here e3 to continue the development and of course to castle. So my point is, when you understand those key principles, it's much simpler for you to understand the concrete moves as well as to find it in your own games. Now, before we dive deeper into the ideas behind the Queen's Gambit, 30 seconds of very useful advertisement how you can forget about all opening pain once and for all in just 10 days. Imagine how cool it would be to play chess without ever having opening troubles again. What if I told you I could teach you all openings you will ever need in just 10 days? You get lifetime access to more than 110 pure value video tutorials, almost 100 practical tasks to apply your knowledge immediately into practice, 30 plus bonus videos to dive 10 times deeper, as well as private community where all questions you might ever have are answered daily. Get a $200 limited time discount with the link in the description and forget about all opening pain once and for all. I hope you feel inspired. There is still a chance to take advantage of that launch sale, and you have absolutely zero risk due to 100% money back guarantee. So I can just sincerely recommend you do it. Anyway, let's continue here. What black does? Black just plays knight b to d7, just continuing the development as well. Once again, h6 is available on every move, but there is a difference which happens whenever you play that move. So now white has a few different ways to go on. I typically play here the move queen to c2. The main line among masters, strictly speaking, is rook to c1. Doesn't matter. The point is, white is trying to make all of the useful moves before they develop this bishop. The reason being is that once you develop it, you can do it immediately, of course, but then you kind of lose a tempo here, lose one move. Why? Because black takes it, and then you're making the second move with the same piece. You're breaking that golden principle we have talked about before. One piece, one move. That is always your goal. Here, it's not possible because your bishop is hanging and you have to take it. To avoid that situation, white is trying to develop everything else, like rook, the queen, saying that if you want to take that pawn, I'm gonna be happy to take it back with just one bishop move and save my time like that. And the reason why white doesn't want to take that early, because that would help this bishop to be developed. Now, after knight bd7, you already, kind of can do that. It's not that dangerous anymore. That's why black sometimes tries to delay the move knight b to d7, and those are those tricks. But you know now the nature behind it. Anyway, rook c1, black plays c6 just to stabilize the entire pawn chain here. You see it's rock solid now. And the main line here is bishop to d3. Now it's time to develop it. What I do instead, I play queen to c2. And once they play c6, I might just develop my rook first. That is also the main line here, or just take immediately. Then they do something else. I take here on d5, they take it back, and I play the move bishop to d3. Now I'm attacking that pawn on h7. And remember, I promised you to explain why you should or should not play the move h6. One of the key ideas that black has in this setup is to remaneuver this knight all the way to g6. And obviously, if you play the move h6, then you don't have enough defenders for the knight. That's why historically they said you don't want to play h6 as black in the Queen's Gambit. Nowadays they don't care about it. They say, well, I have so many ideas, let me just play h6 and win my tempo. But, well, that's rather a question of style. It's up to you to decide whether you want to do that or not. Anyway, I wanted you to know about this idea. And then the main idea that black has is to play here knight to e4 one day. That would just help, let's say, castles. That would just help to avoid all of development problems, because black, of course, still lacks a little bit of space and development issues, but with the move knight e4, they are trying to solve all of that. The tactical justification behind this move is that if you are just taking it twice, then unfortunately this bishop is hanging there. So it doesn't work like that. You might try to take with the bishop instead, and now if pawn takes, then knight takes e4, protecting there. But it also doesn't really work, because bishop f5, you have a horrible pin here, and that's not going to end well for you. So there is basically no way for white to win the pawn. And that bishop is also hanging. So you might either go back to f4 or take it here. Queen takes, and then bishop takes, pawn takes, knight d2. That is like a very normal continuation. All of that can happen a little bit earlier if black plays knight to e4 instead of playing knight f8. So, like I said, I'm not showing you all of the possible lines here until move 30. Instead, I want to explain you the ideas. And this knight f4 idea, it's not pinned to this concrete position, knight f8 and then castles. It's there for black in pretty much all of the variations. And of course, if you are black, you must take advantage of it. That's really helping a lot. For example, you can do it right now. Now, once again, the bishop is hanging. If you take it, you remember it's not possible to win that pawn. If you take it, then black has enough defenders for this knight, and that is how it works. Once again, taking with the knight is not possible, because this time we are just losing a piece. So white normally takes with the bishop, and then knight goes to d2. Then, once again, historically, that is what they taught me when I was a kid, that you don't play the move f5, you just play knight f6 instead, because it helps you to develop the bishop faster and finish your development. At the same time, the knight protects the pawn. Modern engines just don't care about anything. They say knight f6 is fine, f5 is fine, everything you were taught as a kid doesn't matter anymore. Anyway, I wanted to explain it to you. So knight takes f6, that is the main line, at least in my opinion. And now if you castle, which is a very normal move in most of the cases, then somehow black starts to attack you here. And that might not be that funny anymore. This knight is coming, this queen is coming. And of course, as white, you want to create some counterplay on the other side of the board. You want to play knight c4, or the engine is going crazy here. It says f4. Might be interesting, might be useful to remember this idea, because the tactical justification works, unfortunately, only against this bishop f5 move. Is that now the bishop is hanging, and that is why you want to play f4 just now, so that you have somehow more ideas to deal with that black's attack. Here you just defend it, and then when the queen is coming, seemingly very dangerous, you have knight f1. Now the queen is guarding that square, the knight is guarding h2, everything is safe, you're gonna kick the knight away and enjoy your position. So useful idea to remember against bishop f5, but if black does something else, then it's rather not that simple. On the other hand, it's not that simple to play knight g4, because the pawn is hanging if you don't play bishop f5. So you can play bishop f5 now. Next move is black, as after g6, your bishop is going to be protected. Let's say h3, bishop goes to f5. And, well, on the other hand, white has guarded this g4 square and can focus on creating some counterplay here. So knight to c4 is one of the ways to go forward. Black is trying to attack here. Then the question is, as it always happens in chess, who is going to be the first one to create some really dangerous threats for the opponent? Very good principle to remember. If your opponent attacks you on the side, answer in the center. So you can clearly see black is creating some threats here on the king side. So what you need to do, you want to answer in the center. How you can do that? Well, you can go forward and blow up the position, because those side attacks, they're working only if the center is closed. If the center is opened, normally you don't want to attack on the side with your pawns at all, because you're just opening up your king, and that might be very, very dangerous. That's why if your opponent is attacking you on the side with pawns, you want to blow up the center completely so you can go in with your pieces and punish your opponent for that side attack. Now white creates a lot of threats. This pawn can take, this pawn can go forward. If it takes, then the knight can go here, and that might be all very dangerous. Well, you might try to deal with that with the help of the rook, but then just needs to destroy everything here in the center. Once again, trying to exchange some stuff here, just rook takes, and then maybe knight a5, trying to exploit those weaknesses. This is a classical example how it might go wrong for the black side, because that attack is still not ready for black. I mean, you still need a lot of moves to make it happen, whereas white is already delivering that threat. So once again, very important, who is the first one to create the first very dangerous threat? To avoid all of that, black can just take here on d5, knight takes, rook takes, and then we reach a very normal position, very balanced here, but I would say a little bit simpler to play as white at this point, because this pawn might become a weakness and this bishop is not that great. That's a very good advice for you. If you have a bishop against the knight, you should try to be aiming for a position where all of your pawns are on the dark squares, because this way the pawns are controlling the dark squares and your bishop is guarding the light squares. Of course, if you have dark squares bishop, it's vice versa. But if both your pawns and your bishop are on dark squares, then absolutely nobody is taking care of the dark squares, and that's why you have a lot of weaknesses among dark squares here, and white is taking advantage of that. So that is how things work in this variation. Black is trying to deliver a checkmate, and white is trying to get some counterplay in the center or on the queen side. We are going to see more ideas in a moment here, but that is a global picture, so to say. Now I want to show you another classical plan from the white side here. Instead of the move rook to d1, white can just take the pawn on d5 immediately. I also played it a lot of times in my own games. Black plays rook e8, has the similar idea in mind, or knight f8. I mean, those are two typical plans for black. Either you play for knight e4, or you play for knight to g6 and remaneuver your knight like that. Your bishop is free to go. And what white can do? First of all, white plays h3, very useful move to cover the square on g4, because otherwise this bishop might be coming after knight g6, for example, or immediately. Then you might have some difficulties with it. Bishop goes to e6. This classical plan for white is called the minority attack. Why the minority? Well, if you take a look at this side of the board, the queen side, white has here 3 pawns, those d4 and those two a2, b2, whereas black has 4 pawns. And the idea behind the minority attack is to push this pawn all the way to b5, take it there on c6, and then that c6 pawn is becoming a weakness. See that we don't have any pawns along the c file from the white side, so we can just put our pieces there, the rooks, the queen, and attack that weakness on c6, or we can also block it with the knight, placing the knight on c5. And if we achieve that, then also the a7 pawn becomes a weakness as well, and though in that case black has 2 weaknesses and white is attacking it, whereas black is, of course, as always, trying to deliver a checkmate on the king side of the board. So giving a checkmate is basically the main idea behind the queen's gambit for black. Now, how white is trying to achieve that goal? White plays rook to b1, just preparing the move b4, b5. Now, from the black side, very useful to remember that you don't want to get those 2 weaknesses on a7 and c6. If you have to suffer with some weaknesses, it should be just the c6 pawn. How to do that? Well, you just play the move a5, because here white can play a3 and prepare the move b4, but then you're going to take. First of all, you no longer have that weakness on a7 anymore, and secondly, you're opening up the a file, which also might be useful. Your rook is immediately activated, even though it hasn't made any moves yet. Meanwhile, black is playing knight f to d7. Of course, it's just one of the possibilities, the main line, but there are different moves to go, and we don't want to exchange the pieces. That's also one of the main principles in the opening. If you're the side who is having more space, more initiative, and your opponent doesn't have enough space for his pieces, you don't want to exchange the pieces. Because imagine you have like 5 good squares as black, and you have 7 pieces for that. Then you have a problem. Yeah, I can actually show you 7 on my one hand. But anyway, you don't have enough space for all of your pieces. But if your opponent helps you and exchange a few pieces, then it becomes simpler for you. You have enough squares for all of your pieces. That is why instead of just taking on e7 and simplifying the task for black, white is going back and try to save more pieces on the board. And once knight goes to g7, moreover, this bishop goes all the way to h2 just to prevent that exchange for bishop for a knight. By the way, so many lower-rated players make that mistake that they sometimes even voluntarily exchange their bishop for a knight. I can never understand that. In 99% of the cases, the bishop is just stronger than the knight. There are extremely close positions where the bishop might be just completely stuck. Of course, like every rule in chess, there are so many exceptions. That's why chess is such a complicated game. But in general, bishop is just stronger than the knight. So don't exchange voluntarily your bishop for a knight if you don't win anything significant afterwards. Anyway, bishop goes to h2, and now this plan is about to happen. So for example, knight to b6, you can play b4 immediately, and that is going on. But this is a little bit more difficult than that, because black wants to jump here to c4, and then the knight is very solid, so we don't want to do that. We want to be a little bit more flexible, so we play knight d2 first, and that a little bit going into the depths. But you need to understand that you don't play chess alone, and even though you might have a very interesting idea, you you mastered the minority attack, you want to implement it in your game, but you're not playing alone. Your opponent also has some ideas, and you need to take it into account. And if your opponent plays knight b6 with a clear intention to go to c4, and you have a very clear way to stop it, then maybe you should do it before going all in for your idea. So chess is a constant battle of those ideas. Both sides have it. So white has prepared this idea of playing b4 or b5, but black has prepared the idea of challenging it with knight to c4. And so white is not that fast to do it, and black is there with a passive knight otherwise on b6, because its only purpose is to fight against that idea. For example, if you do play the move b4 that early, you're already in trouble. I can take it immediately, and then the knight goes to c4. The knight is very good here. You can take it, and yes, you have a lot of pawns in the center, but on the other hand, and you even can play b5, but on the other hand, you do give up your bishop's pair. Now the position is getting exposed, and that bishop's pair can actually play a huge role. But all of that is just too much into the details. I just want you to know this plan. So you play rook b1, you prepare the move b4, you try to create that weakness on c6, and then you try to target it. Another idea that is basically an alternative to rook b1 and the minority attack is placing the knight on e5, and then trying to support it with the move f4. Now, if you want to achieve that, you absolutely need to start with h3, because if you do it one move earlier and don't play h3, then black has a fantastic way to deal with your threat and play knight to g4. Then your knight is under attack, and the biggest problem is you never have the opportunity to play f4, because that pawn on e3 is hanging with a fork there. So you absolutely cannot afford that. For example, bishop takes, the queen takes. Now you have a problem. What do you do with this knight? You would be happy to play that, but unfortunately you're just losing. Knight g4 is very annoying. That's why white is playing h3 first, like I said, just to cover that square. But if you want to do that, it's even more important. And then after bishop e6, you actually can play knight e5, and then you're ready to execute your plan. That is also one of the ideas. And then basically you attack in the center. You no longer want to attack here. You want to play f4, maybe in some cases f5, and even connect those pawns. But be careful with that, because pawns never go back, and you it might backfire if you are not doing it reasonable. Now let's go back to the starting position, and I'm gonna show you the third plan that white has in this type of positions. That requires this knight not to be on f3. That's why we need to get all the way back here. Then instead of playing knight f3 here or next move, white is just taken there. Then playing bishop g5. Remember, when you take on d5, you limit your opponent's potential. So for example, this d takes c is no longer a move, and black is not that flexible anymore. Now, even though it's possible for black to develop that light squares bishop, which is often the problem in the Queen's Gambit, not always they really do that. Sometimes they just play c6, that is the main line, e3, and just bishop e7, just developing the same way as before. And now knight b to g7. And if we play knight f3, we are back to square one, that is the variation we just had before. But white has now an additional opportunity to develop the knight not to f3, but to g2. The reason behind that is that it might be a little bit more flexible in terms of your plan to attack in the center. The plan is to play f3 and e4. Let's say black plays rook to e8, we just castle, and also from the perspective of this knight e4 idea, it's also better to have your knight on e2, because once you take it there with a knight, let's say, you're not running into that fork when the pawn attacks both pieces and you are just losing a piece. So the main line is knight to f8, and then white plays f3, preparing that move e4. Now it's not that simple again, because white basically never plays that e4 move too early. White is preparing that move, just making everything possible around it, develop all of the pieces, just getting ready for it for as long as possible, because once you play e4, there is no way back, and then d4 might become a weakness and you always need to guard those pawns. That might be dangerous. So white is trying to prepare that as long as possible. For example, this rook goes to either d1 or e1, depending on basically a matter of style as well, because both moves are possible. Rook goes to c8, then the king goes away, so there are no checks possible in terms of e4, and then maybe something crazy going on. At least the king won't be in check. And so there are so many moves white can do to prepare that move. a3, knight goes back to d7, bishop e7, queen takes e7. So we do everything possible. We still want to play e4 one day, but we never play it. It's like, this, once again, psychological game between the two sides. Black is worried because they know that at some point that e4 pawn move might be coming, and they have to be prepared for it at any possible point. And white, on the other hand, wants to delay that move for as long as possible. So they play the move knight to g3, which both prepares the e4 move as well as wants to jump to f5 with the tempo. So that makes this move a multi-purpose move, and that is another tip I have for you. Always try to make your moves multi-purpose so that it could be as useful for you as it's humanly possible. And then you make it more difficult for your opponent, because he doesn't know what to expect from you, whether you're gonna play e4 finally, or maybe place your knight on f5. Finally, when you are 100% ready for that push pawn in the center, you do that, and then you try to take maximum advantage out of that and attack your opponent in the center and normally on the king side. Now, as I promised you, let's take a look at the second opportunity, not placing the bishop on g5, but placing it on f4. Then, of course, the e3, f3, e4 idea is not that great anymore, so that normally happens here. And instead of playing the move bishop to g5, white places the bishop on f4 with some ideas here. The difference is there is no tension anymore along this diagonal. Of course, that key knight e4 idea, which was there for black in the bishop g5 variation, simply doesn't exist anymore. Like, the knight e4 itself is a possible move, but there is no attack against the bishop anymore. Black castles, white plays e3, and now black thinks, well, if the bishop is no longer on g5, maybe I can not necessarily defend my pawn on d5 one more time with c6 and be as solid as possible. Maybe I have something more active. Maybe I can play knight b to d7 and prepare the move c5 immediately to challenge white's center. Because you remember, the center is the most important thing in chess, so you need to fight against it or try to control it. If you can't, then fight for it. So that is what black is trying to achieve with move c5. And you also remember that chess is a battle of ideas. So white, of course, knows that c5 is coming. So what white says, let me prepare against that. Let me stop that opportunity for you forever. And that's why I'm going to play c5 myself. That is a very interesting option, because you see how powerful that pawn chain is, and well, white is ready to support it. If you try to attack it somehow, then b4 is completely possible just to protect that, then a5, a3, and everything is solid. But in this particular case, b6 is not even a move at all because of c6 immediately. And then you always need to be aware of that when you are playing as black, because that might always happen. You are not fully developed yet, and you might suffer because of it, because you are spending so much time. This knight is spending another move for the same piece, which you remember, you break the golden development rule, and also you just go back. So you haven't achieved nothing at all. And then, of course, the pawn needs to be protected. But if white achieves that, then black might be in trouble. So after c5, black is not trying to do that. They instead try to get some counterplay. To do that, they play on the other side of the board. That's very typical. Your opponent plays on one side of the board, you play on another one, or in the center. So this knight h5 move is possible because the bishop is hanging and there is absolutely no way to save it. So basically, black is exchanging the knight for a bishop and enjoy two bishops advantage. What white says is that, well, you may enjoy your two bishops advantage, but that bishop on c8 is absolutely not a dangerous bishop for me. And this bishop on f4, well, remember what I told you about the pawns and the bishop? All of the pawns are on the dark squares, so I really need my light squares, but not the dark squares bishop. That's why I'm fine with an exchange. I can play bishop d3, that knight can take, and now I have exactly that situation when my bishop is controlling the light squares, whereas the pawns are controlling the dark squares and everything is under control. Now black is coming back to that idea of attacking that pawn chain, so we need to protect it. c6 is not that great anymore because knight b8 and that pawn will be very vulnerable, very difficult to protect it. For example, queen a4, we just go queen d6 and we have too many attackers for that pawn. You can try to defend it that way, but then f6 is coming. If you are defending it that way instead, then yeah, sooner or later you're gonna get into trouble here. There is actually a very cute idea that the engine suggests here for black. You could play a6, but seemingly it's not such a big deal because there is a pin. But what black is doing after, let's say, castles, a developing move for white, they play rook to a7 and they prepare to take there on b5. The difference is the queen on a7 is going to be more vulnerable. So let's say we play rook a1, then they take it. Then after queen takes, there is knight e6 with a tempo. If the queen would be on 8 now, that wouldn't be a tempo. And the problem is the queen has absolutely no good squares to go, because if you go to a3, there is b4 with a fork. If you go to a8, I can just attack you, and then once again you are in trouble. You can go here to b7, then rook goes to b8, queen goes there, knight b4. I mean, that is some crazy variation, and white is in trouble here. So you have to be careful with that c6 move. If you have such an opportunity and that works for you, then c6 might be a very powerful move. But if you're not able to defend the pawn and not get into trouble, then you don't want to do that, and instead just support the pawn with a b4 move. a5, we still have a way. The main thing is that we maintain that pawn chain. So that is one way to go about it for white, to play c5 and physically block that pawn. Another way can be just to prepare against that and play a3 and say, well, if you want, you can go for it, but I do have some ideas afterwards. What are those ideas? Well, we take here immediately on d5 and we are creating an isolated pawn, because once they take somehow on d5, we are prepared to take the second pawn and then d5 would be isolated. The main move for black is to take with the knight, we take it, and then we take there. And here you have it, this isolated pawn. Now, it's very tricky, those pawns, because in the endgame, yes, you say that isolated pawn is a weakness because there is no supporting pawns on either of the sides, so that's going to be a target we are going to attack. But in the middle game, that pawn can actually help the side who has it to somehow launch an attack, go forward, create something dangerous. So white is trying their best to stop this pawn and to block it. You always want to block the isolated pawn, because if you have, let's say, the knight in front of the pawn, the knight is a perfect blockator. There are no pawns on the side to attack that knight, and the pawn itself cannot go forward. So that is an ideal situation. Well, let me give you an example variation here. The bishop goes to e5 because this diagonal is extremely important to cover. So black is trying to fight against that bishop and exchange that. Bishop takes and then queen d4. Once again, always keep an eye on that isolated pawn, try to block it, and that gives white a slight advantage here. Not a lot, because apart from that long-term weakness on d5, black is doing absolutely fine. But that is exactly what white is counting on, that in sooner or later that pawn becomes a weakness here. White can of course exchange the queens, and just please never ever take with the pawn. That would just destroy the entire idea and make it basically winning for black, because your king is exposed here and black is much better in terms of the development. You take with the knight and then you block that pawn. You have that isolated pawn as your target. If you take with the pawn, you don't have it anymore. And then you just need to finish your development. Even if we are already actually entering the endgame territory, you still need to finish your development. That rule stays with you for the entire game. And even if you have moved with all of your pieces at least once, still, you always need to look at it and make sure that each and every single one of your pieces has some job to do. You don't want any unemployment going on in your camp. So then the game goes on, bishop d2, f3, bishop e2, whatever might happen. There are different ways, but white is trying to finish the development, place the rooks along the d file, and attack that pawn, whereas black tries to create some counterplay for that. So yeah, maybe the c file, which is completely open here, place the rook here, try to get with the rook to the c file. So you need to get some counterplay as a compensation for that isolated pawn if you are black. Finally, if a white just ignores that threat altogether and plays bishop e2, remember the same principle we learned in the bishop g5 variation applies here. Black waits for white to develop the bishop and then takes. Then they can play c5 once again, and that situation reaches some kind of a symmetrical position. White is just a tiny bit better here, but actually everything is symmetrical. Black doesn't have any real problems. Maybe this bishop is just more passive than this guy so far here, because if you imagine this one being here, it's also passive, but it's already out, whereas this bishop still needs a way to be developed, but there is a way, so it's not a big deal. So the position is close to equal here for black. The main line being castles and then just queen takes, reaching that endgame, playing b6, finishing the development, and well, normally it should go towards a draw, but of course in a real practical chess game, especially if the players are not that experienced, everything can still happen. And then if the position is symmetrical, you just want to play on the activity. You want to be the first one to go on to attack, to create some threats for your opponent, even though in such a position that's of course very, very difficult. But maybe rook c1, finishing the development, maybe b4 at some point, knight b5, jump somewhere and create a few threats. Maybe this knight comes. So symmetrical position, you're white, you're having a little bit of more time, try to use it smartly. White, of course, can say, well, I don't want to take the c5 pawn and instead just castle, but black says, I don't care, then I'm gonna take it myself. Then queen takes, knight b6, and still the queens are going off the board, the position is still symmetrical, completely equal according to the engine, even though there is still a problem with this bishop, but apparently it's not a huge problem, you just finish your development, and everything is fine, everything is solid. The main thing is you don't have any weaknesses as black. So that means if you're white and you want to get a fighting position, if you want to fight for the victory, you rather don't want to allow such a simple simplification for black, and that's why c5 is so popular on the top level. I hope you have a very good understanding now in terms of what kind of ideas you can get in the Queen's Gambit decline from both sides, and of course how to react to it. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about that course that I have created, the opening course, so that you can forget about all of the opening problems once and for all, here I have prepared a more detailed video for you, so you can take a look at what you get. That is a fantastic offer. I can just sincerely recommend you take a deeper look on that.